We got a pretty good crew. And kick us off. So today we are going to have a presentation from NAO, but that's probably going to be the shortest part of our agenda. We're going to spend the vast majority of today going through our potential recommendations. We're going to use the same process we did before, where we're just going to kind of have some generative discussion, see how we can kind of consolidate and streamline some of these things. Each slide has a series of options on it. Some of them can go together, some of them don't really go together, just like last time. Although you all happen to make all three of those things go together on that slide when I really thought it was going to be like a pick two situation. So we'll see kind of where we land with these ones. If we're feeling good, we may take some votes today. If we're just like really deep in discussion, we might just kind of continue to consolidate these and save some votes for August. But our goal is definitely to have all of our recommendations done and votes done by the end of the August meeting. So we're going to go ahead and start with our roll call. And the question that I have for you all today, it cracks me up when it gets like super big when you copy and paste it from something else. But there we go. So we'll do a little bit of roll call. And the question just is, what has surprised you most in this process? We've gotten a lot of information. We've heard from a lot of people. What has surprised you most in this process? So I'm going to start at the bottom of my list and work up. And just give a little here and your response to the question. Helen, are you with us today?
Yep, I think what surprised me most about this process is the wide variation across different agencies in trying to do either contracting or grant making, and yeah, just every single aspect of that.
Definitely. Leah. Are you with us this morning, Leah?
Mercedes, Leah is unable to attend today.
Thank you. Marianne.
Well, I totally agree with Helen. The fragmentation and siloing of all the different agencies is so bizarre to me that we are the state of Oregon, but everybody's doing their own thing.
Bettina.
I can probably say ditto, but I also was surprised that there was no recognition of adjusting was COLA when the departments themselves had COLA increases, but contracts with their subcontractors weren't thought of in the same process. It was surprising to me that they didn't consider that as a normal automatic too.
Thank you. Felicia.
Good morning, everyone here. Definitely what everyone has shared. And then also, I think that, we hear so much from the, in my case, grantees, but the nonprofits around resource constraints and not having the tools they need. And we also heard the same from the state agencies, whether they are working with an Excel sheet to do grants management or whatnot. That really stands out to me. Thanks.
Thank you. Danesh, are you with us today? Not yet. Katrina.
Good morning. I think the thing that has surprised me the most is how complex some of the grant making processes can be. I mean, I knew they were because of what we were experiencing on this end, but then to hear it described was really eye-opening and validating in a way.
Yeah, thank you. Tamara, are you with us today? Yep. Jonathan.
Hi. With myself, I think from the DOJ perspective, I was most surprised at the many ideas people had about the role we play and the role we don't play. And that was very interesting to hear all those different viewpoints of, oh, we in terms of these perceptions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Heather.
I agree with everything that's been said. I also think that it was very humanizing to hear directly from all of the state agency staff. And I think they're dealing with the complexity of a lack of a system as well. And I kind of got this sense that we all want this fixed. Nobody likes that the status is the way that it is. And I appreciated that. And I think my biggest surprise, though, was that Department of Education manages 10,000 contracts a year and how wildly inefficient that is. I think it's totally inappropriate, but that's just me. I think it's very costly.
Debbie.
Good morning. I think for me, the most surprising, there were many surprises. I think the most surprising were some of the anecdotal stories that we heard about the impact of the trickle-down effect and the impact of the inconsistencies on the state side.
And Andre.
Good morning. Ditto to everything that folks have been saying. I think the most surprising thing may be that I was very unsurprised at the level of complexity that was before us. So, but yeah, I think I agree with what everyone else has said as well.
Thank you. And me here. I think the thing that surprised me most was I didn't feel as much like I was trying to convince people that there was a problem. And I think I've been in that mode for so long that it was actually really nice to kind of be in a space where it felt like, no, we totally know this could be more efficient. I loved this staff presentations bringing their own recommendations and sharing those. And I hope as we go through these set of recommendations, I would really love for our staff, our agency representatives, to be sharing with us things around feasibility, because I think that's the biggest question that we're going to be left walking out of here is, these are going to feel like good ideas. I think we're going to land in good places. But we're still going to be wondering, how feasible are some of these things? And so the more you all can help us out a little bit with that, around where you see the kind of critical points that need to be addressed in order for things to be feasible, would deeply appreciate that ongoing guidance. So thank you everybody for being on the same page as much as we have been, which has been great. And looking forward to getting into more of our recommendation discussions today. We're going to start with public comment. Do we have anybody here who would like to provide public comment? I think you can use the raised hand function to kind of identify yourself. And then I think we can bring you up to the presenter mode from the audience. Okay, not seeing any hands. I think maybe we're okay as far as public comment goes. So the first thing up on our agenda then is going to be a presentation from the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. So we had NAO come and present right at the beginning. I think it was December or January. They came and let us know about some of the research that they had been doing. And then they entered into another set of research around specifically wages. And they're going to come and share with us some of the things that they've learned. So really excited. I believe we have Kevin, Jim, and Amanda, and I'll hand it over to you all. We're going to aim for about 15 minutes for this one. But we do want to make sure we have time for questions. I think, Jim, did you want us to hold questions for the end?
Yes, thank you. If you could hold questions to the end, that'd be great. I think I'm up first, so I'm going to introduce our two speakers here briefly. But I just wanted to say I'm Jim White. I'm the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. You may all know we joined with Northwest Health Foundation to push forward SB 606 to create this task force. So as such, we have a deep interest in the outcomes of your work. NAO has been working to conduct several studies to augment the information you may already have that you can make the best informed recommendations. Today, I'm honored to introduce two studies that we've recently conducted. The first was conducted by Amanda Manjarrez, who's a nonprofit consultant and attorney, and it's a review of current language in state contracts and grants that cause significant issues for implementing nonprofits. The second study was conducted by Dr. Kevin Cahill and the team at Echo Northwest, and it's an econometric study of nonprofit wages in Oregon with specific emphasis on social service nonprofits. And these are the nonprofits that are largely doing the work of the government through grants and contracts. You may remember we previously submitted our suggestions for solutions to the task force, so I encourage you to review those as you come to the recommendation phase of your work. We believe that you have the opportunity not only to support immediate administrative changes, but also long-term statutory changes in the frameworks of how government works with nonprofits. We strongly believe it's going to take both to make long-term systemic change. So please reach out if you have any questions to either myself or Philip Kennedy Wong, our Director of Public Policy. And Amanda, I'm turning it over to you. And I'm going to share my screen because Amanda has... she has a PowerPoint. We have a PowerPoint both for Amanda and for Kevin. And so let me see if I have that ability. Can you all see my screen now?
Looks good.
Okay.
All right. Can folks hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Awesome. Great. Thank you, Jim. For the sake of brevity, I just wanted to thank you all first for the opportunity to present to you today. My name is Amanda Manjarrez. I'm a nonprofit consultant. As Jim mentioned, I was engaged by NAO to review which provisions in government contracts with nonprofits might be impacting their financial ability to provide fair wages to their employees. And to ensure my review is not duplicative of the important work of this task force, I focused primarily on examining the legal framework that guides decision-making within Oregon's grant-making and procurement systems to inform policy recommendations. Next slide. So I'll share these initial findings with you all just to level set. They're probably just reiterating what you've already learned during your meetings, but maybe offer a sense of the why this is happening. First, Oregon's public contracting code found in ORS 279A is what governs the state system of procurement for public contracts generally. There are also exceptions. And I'll just note that public contracts for procuring goods and services are separate and distinct from grant agreements used for programs and services targeted to the public. Those are two different things on purpose. Second, it's important to be aware that the Public Contracting Code statute explicitly states that this code does not apply to grants, and Oregon doesn't have a similar comprehensive code to guide how grant making should operate. This gap has obviously led to a variety of approaches, a lot of what was mentioned during the introductions, to grant making across agencies. Some agencies are creating their own grant making systems, ODE, OHA are some of those examples, and others are using procurement language and templates designed for business operations for their agreements with nonprofits providing social services to the public, which is actually the primary source I'm seeing that is driving some of the financial concerns that are showing up and being voiced by nonprofits. Finally, our state does have agency-wide grant procedures and templates, but those are only being applied when federal funding is involved because federal law governs in those cases. And importantly, the federal government does distinguish between grants and public services, grants for public services and grants used for procurement purposes. Next slide. So I understand that there has been a proposal that would change the rule definition of public contract to include grants. In effect, that would collapse the term and do two things from my perspective that are a little bit concerning. First, is it would make the term more ambiguous because the same term would be used for multiple types of contracts. And second, it would force grants to fit within the current procurement scheme, which appears to be, again, the fundamental issue based on my analysis that's causing some of the problems for nonprofits. In addition, I think it's helpful to look at what the statute actually says, because this statute is what's being used as the authority for that rule. So the statute defines procurement and its relationship to public contracts. It also defines the term public contract and says a public contract is not a grant. It says that very clearly. And the section of the statute that refers to how the law should be applied explicitly states that this code does not apply to grants. Therefore, creating a rule that says public contracts are grants under this authority appears to conflict with the statute's plain language and is contrary to the legislative intent of this whole code. Next slide. So that brings me to a few policy recommendations that are still emerging. They aren't far from what you've been discussing, but maybe offer a different approach or a way to think about this comprehensively. Based on my analysis of the legal framework and how it's being implemented, I would recommend the following: that Oregon establish a grant making code in statute with general procedures and requirements for grant making specifically that apply to all state agencies. And this policy should be clearly distinguished from Oregon's public contracting code, which is currently tailored specifically for public contracting within the context of procurement. This policy should also provide authority for the administration to create uniform rules aligned to the federal system that include standard provisions for more equitable grant making practices. So this is where payment distribution versus reimbursement models would live, cost of living adjustments, de minimis admin rates, allowable expenses, et cetera. These rules should apply to all agency programs unless otherwise specified by law. Finally, a chief grant making officer position should be created in DAS to oversee implementation of this new code and to provide training and guidance to support grant making across all state agencies, including how to determine whether a grant agreement or a public contract for procurement purposes is the appropriate mechanism to use when partnering with a nonprofit for services. Next slide. This is my last one, I promise. As you consider your final recommendation, I wanted to leave you with this example of a provision under the federal regulations, which helps agencies distinguish between grants and contracts used for procurement purposes. So subrecipient is in this regulation, it's a term that's used for grants. Contractor is the term that's used in the procurement contracts. I'm sharing this and leaving you with this because, as I mentioned, all of Oregon state agencies already have a system and forms to comply with these federal regulations because they govern once federal grant funding is involved. I also noticed that ODE cited this specific provision in their memo when describing how they determine whether to use a grant agreement or public contract within their own agency. Therefore, it seems to make much more sense to align state level grant making requirements and procedures with the federal grant regulations to create a comprehensive system of grant making for Oregon that accommodates multiple funding sources, rather than forcing grants to comply with the current procurement scheme, which is fundamentally different in purpose, substance, and in the type of relationship it creates between a state agency and a nonprofit organization. So that's what I had for you today, and I'll hand it back to Jim, but I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Amanda. And now we're going to go over to Dr. Kevin Cahill.
Great, thanks, Jim. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Cahill. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk about a research study that we did that was funded by NAO. We conducted a econometric study titled "Are Wages Suppressed in the Nonprofit Social Services Sector?" A case study in Oregon. This is research with two of my colleagues, Jonathan Ely and Aditya Gadkari at ECHO. I do want to mention that this is a full white paper that will hopefully be published in an academic journal. If anyone is interested in it, they can hopefully contact Jim or me directly. And I also want to mention that the slides that I'm going to present right now are part of a presentation that I did at the Western Economics Association meetings 2 weeks ago in front of a group of economists, because this is an economic study. So if anyone wants to see the full set of slides, can also contact me or Jim. Okay, next slide, Jim. And just to set everyone's expectations, I have a total of 6 slides, and I'm told 8 minutes or less. So I will meet that. But we were contacted by Jim and Philip in January to do a study that was impartial and rigorous. I think those are 2 things that are key, is that we were hired by NAO to do an impartial study. So as ECHO Northwest typically does, we are looking at data to tell the story. So you can think of me as a messenger. I'm an economist, but I'm a messenger for what the data actually say. And also rigorous. I have a PhD in economics, but Jim and Philip wanted the study to be following standard practices in the economic space. So we had 3 objectives. The first was to compare wages and work between social service nonprofits and other industries in the private and public sectors. Is there a difference? The second objective is, if there is a difference, how big is it? And it's not just a descriptive statistics exercise. We need to take into account differences in gender, race, and other worker and job characteristics between the sectors, because that could be what's driving wages in both sectors. And then the third was, and you can think of me as the messenger on 1 and 2. On 3, I'm a little bit more than a messenger. On 3, I'm an economist offering policy recommendations. So in the discussion section of our white paper, we offer 5 policy recommendations. Okay, so next slide, Jim. So this is quick. What I'm going to do today in the 8 minutes, I'm going to talk about our data and methods very briefly. Then I'm going to talk about some of our main findings, and then go to the policy recommendations. So it's these 3 things that I'm doing today. Again, the full set of slides could get into some of the details. This is more of an overview. Jim, can you skip 2 slides to the data sets? Oh, back 1. 1 more. Great. Yeah, so what I wanted to relay on this slide is the data sets that we used in the study. So we used 3 of them. One is called the American Community Survey. It's a nationwide annual survey of 3 million individuals in the US, and you can select out individuals that are within the state of Oregon. So we used data from the American Community Survey to look at individuals in Oregon from 2012 to 2023. So a huge data set, wonderful information about individuals' wages, the sector they work in, and then different characteristics. The second is we used the current population survey, which is a monthly survey of 60,000 households conducted by the Census Bureau. That data is wonderful because it has data over time, so we can look at how people change status over time. And then we also use some descriptive statistics from something called the BLS, Occupation, Employment, and Wage Statistics. So we use all 3 of those data sets for our study. Jim, can you move 2 slides ahead? So what I want to relay in terms of findings are the overall descriptive findings and then the final results of our multivariate work. So this is a table that it's in our paper if you want to see the actual details. But there are 3 things that are important takeaways from the descriptive statistics from the American Community Survey. So the first is that the nonprofit sector accounts for about 10.5% of wage and salary employment in Oregon over our time period. Actually, 2012 to 2022, we used partial 23. So wage and salary employment is everyone who is earning wages but not self-employed. So that in Oregon is 10.5% of the workforce. The second thing that's important to take away is the characteristics of the workers in Oregon in the nonprofit sector are different from those in the for-profit sector and the public sector. They're more likely to be female, more likely to be older, more likely to have higher levels of education. And all those things are well-known determinants of wages in economics. So they need to be taken into account. And then the third takeaway is if you look at overall hours worked among the nonprofit sector workers, they're lower than those in other sectors, the for-profit sector and the public sector. So we need to take that into account. So what I think contribution of the paper is, what are wages in the nonprofit sector and social services in particular? How do they compare when you take into account all these differences in the worker characteristics? And that's what we do. So Jim, can you move to the slide that has all the check marks? It's like 3 or 4 ahead. This one right here. So this slide is an attempt to summarize the final takeaway of our study, and you can see in bold text right on the right-hand side about what it is. So we found once you control for age, sex, educational attainment, race, mean hours worked, industry occupation, and time trends, that workers in the nonprofit sector earn about 5 to 15% lower than workers in the for-profit sector and the nonprofit sector. The range is 7 to 11% between nonprofit and public, and 5 to 15 between nonprofit and private. And this is taking into account everything you'd want to take into account with respect to workers and their characteristics. So if you want to see the details, they're all in the paper, they're in the full PowerPoint. But I think that the thing to take away and to keep in your back pocket is that workers in the nonprofit sector are earning less than those in the for-profit sector and public sector, and that magnitude is about 5 to 15%. And that's what we found in the state of Oregon, and it actually is similar nationwide when you look at the economics literature. So that's the real key takeaway. And then I have one more slide. Jim, if you can go to the policy recommendations. Great. So we have a discussion in the paper about what to do about it. The takeaway that we have is there is a wage gap, it's problematic, and something should be done about it. So we have 5 recommendations. One is, and Bettina talked about it in the intro that I heard. One is institute a cost of living adjustment. A $15 minimum, $15 an hour wage in 2020 would have to be $18 an hour today. So inflation matters a lot. So implementing a cost of living adjustment, I think, is one that is the most obvious. But then we also talk about establishing a nonprofit wage board. There needs to be an organization or some board to institute the cost of living adjustment, as well as do a true up. We think setting a prevailing wage for nonprofits, for governments that contract with nonprofits, makes a lot of sense. We think it might be helpful to have a dashboard that's publicly available so people can see how wages are paid in the nonprofit sector. And then we think it might be useful to have a nonprofit wage advocate to advocate for wages in the nonprofit sector not slipping behind those in the for-profit sector and the nonprofit sector. So again, I'll close with that. There's lots more in our slides that we presented at the Westerns. And there's also a full white paper that has our analysis. So Jim, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. And so I think if there's time, Mercedes, if there's any questions from the task force for Amanda or Kevin.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. I don't see anything in the chat. Okay, go ahead, Rep. Conrad, I see your hand.
Thank you, I appreciate it, and thank you for that presentation. One of the things that I'm undecided about but concerned about is the prevailing wage. just knowing how, for at least on local governments, how a prevailing wage reduces the number of projects because it increases the cost substantially. And so is there any work in the or information in the economics literature about what a healthy competitive nonprofit sector would look like if there were prevailing wages added into that? How many nonprofits would go out of business because of the reduction in number of projects, because all the money would be funneled to existing? And also, what is in that any sense on how new and burgeoning nonprofits would be able to survive in a less competitive market that probably would be controlled by larger nonprofits with an existing infrastructure?
Kevin, do you want to try and answer the question around whether there's existing data?
There is, well, in the economics literature, it really focuses on the existence of a wage gap, because I think that's the critical question, which is, are wages lower in the nonprofit sector than in the other sectors? And is it more than just a preference of the workers? So I think that's the key question. And that's where we found it's not just worker preferences, there's more to it. I think to address the question a little bit is, economics is all about trade-offs. And I think just because wages are a certain way now doesn't necessarily imply that that's efficient to move forward. And I think what we have documented in our paper is that the current state is inefficient. That you have wages lower than they should be based on worker characteristics, and that should be corrected because we have these differences in wages. Now, of course, that has implications and there's trade-offs associated with it. But I think our contribution is there is a wage gap and it's problematic. Does that answer the question, or Jim, does that help? I want to make sure that I'm helpful and also answering the question.
I appreciate it. It's the trade-offs because that's really comes down to the policy decision, is the trade-offs and understanding what that's going to look like long-term. And given these trade-offs, is there some way to mitigate some of those? So what are we going to, if step one is a prevailing wage rate and we have this basket of trade-offs, is there a way that we can mitigate that? Or do we need to just accept that these are the trade-offs and just make sure that we communicate that and that we understand it? So it's the policy decision-making that I think is really going to help understand, because if we do, prevailing wage and then, another one and then another one, what is going to be the cumulative effect of all these policy changes, and how do we move forward with that? And then what is the expectation of time? What's going to happen in year one versus what's going to happen in years 5 and 7? Because those are things that we need to look out for as well.
Rep. Conrad, I can just say from our side, you've given us a lot to continue to consider. And so these are some things that we can continue to look into from NAO's side. I don't have the answers for you right now.
Thank you. I appreciate it all. And thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, and anyone who has some thoughts around that, especially on the task force, there's a whole slide where we're going to talk about prevailing wage. So you'll definitely get a bite at the apple to kind of give your perspective on what you think makes sense there. So any more questions for NAO? Helen, I see you.
Thanks. Love this presentation. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I think my question is mainly around cost of implementation. So I think there's a lot of will, both on the government side and through this task force, to really think about what we can do in the short to medium term. And I'm hoping that your research has uncovered more on that.
On the cost of implementation for any of the solutions, Helen? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
It has not yet. And one of the challenges to that is that, and I think the task force has found this, is that the ability for the different line departments to track how many individuals are actually covered by how many contracts and how many grants, it's not data that's currently collected. So it's very hard to categorize then how much, let's say, a across the board COLA would be. That's where I think one of the recommendations of this task force could be to make sure that the government is actually collecting that data and it's in some kind of a usable dashboard so it can be compared and sort of qualified across everyone. What I would just say, one quick comment is that I think the cost of not doing something is going to be even more costly in the long run because of the situation that we're in and the huge holes we now have in social service deployment. People just don't want to take these jobs.
Yeah. Completely agree. Thanks, Jim.
And Katrina, I see you.
I'm curious, Kevin, Jim, if the white paper speaks to sort of driving factors for the gap. I know that there's a lot of theories out there that we run into when we're engaging in this discussion, because a lot of us in the nonprofits have been screaming this from the rooftops for a long time, right? Like, we have a really significant problem. This is an issue. And some of the comeback has always been, well, it was done intentionally because nonprofits should be cheaper than public sector delivering these services. B, if you sign up for a nonprofit, you know that you're going into having a job that's not going to pay what the private sector and what the public sector is going to, so suck it up. C, it's been this way, but it didn't intentionally become this way. We're so sorry. Here are some of the reasons why. Does your white paper delve into that a little bit? Like, were you able to explore that a little bit at all?
We discuss it a bit. I think a qualitative analysis that follows up could be very helpful to look into those things. But I think, Katrina, one of the big things that's in the economics literature, I think there's I'll just say there's 2 points. One is the economics literature talks about what this wage donation, I think that's what you're talking about too, that somehow workers in the nonprofit sector should suck it up because they're doing work that, arguably they want to do, and that there should be a sacrifice with respect to the wages that they're commanding to do that work. I don't find that particularly satisfactory. I think that kind of makes sense, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. One thing that we did send the paper out for review, and NAO helped with this, but I think the structure of the contracting process is a big part of it as well, and that there's uncertainty to have long-term contracts, which you may have in the for-profit sector. And in the for-profit sector, you can have increases in wages over time and career paths, that are well-defined, that in the nonprofit sector, you might not be able to get. And because of that, wages kind of fall behind because there's not this luxury, if you want to call it that, to have career paths that are well-defined. So I think the contracting process is a part of it as well. And I think that's where our policy recommendations come in, is to say this isn't a market like the for-profit sector. There are rigidities here that are causing these wage gaps to emerge and be solidified. So Katrina, I hope that helps. So that's what we talk about in the white paper. I think a qualitative analysis that follows up might be pretty good.
And just so you're aware, Katrina and everyone, we are doing that qualitative analysis. We partnered with the Coalition of Communities of Color, and they're going to be doing that research work for us. In fact, the first cohort group discussion on the findings from Kevin's paper is taking place this Friday. And maybe by your August or September meetings, we can bring forward additional information.
All
Thank
right,
you.
Bettina, you'll wrap it up for us. Last question.
Yeah, I had a last question, Kevin, for the data. When I think about comparison of wages, I also think of long-term purse and other benefits, especially for public employees. I wondered if you had taken those into account when you did the comparisons, because for us, when I think about why people go into the public sector, I think about some of those benefits as well and total, lifetime wages.
In the American Community Survey, we have whether or not someone has a pension, but we don't have the actual values. So our focus looks at hourly wages. But I think what's really important is you still see a wage gap between the public sector and the nonprofit sector. So I think if you were to take into account the magnitude of public pensions, it actually would be bigger than what we're measuring in our paper.
Thank you so much, NAO. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you for being here and sharing this information. I did see a question about the slides. Although the slides weren't sent out early, they are published on our task force website. Okay, so we're going to start jumping in. I'm going to go through a little bit of just a reminder of kind of our next steps in this process. So this is just, again, a reminder of kind of how we're going to go through this. We're going to go through this the way we did before. We're going to look at our recommendations. We're going to have some debate and consolidation. We'll measure readiness for voting with the green, yellow, red. We'll make the motions, and then we'll vote when we're ready. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, if we don't get to all of the votes, if we spend a lot of time in discussion today, that's fine. But we do need to get to final recommendations in the August meeting. This is also a reminder about the prioritization. We'll do this piece last. This is where we're going to plot our recommendations by the 4 quadrants. So it's not us prioritizing them. We're going to try to give our reader an opportunity to see their priorities within our suite of recommendations. And then this is the remainder of the agenda. So we're going to go through 2 of our slides. We'll take a little break. We'll go through the last 3, and then we'll pop back up to the top, and we'll see if we're ready for votes at the end. These are our group agreements from the beginning. So just a reminder that we're listening to learn and sharing to advance. We're trying to stay in that get to yes mind frame. We're taking space and we're giving space with intention. We have a lot of folks in this space who have a lot of expertise and ideas. So we want to make sure that we're making space for everyone to be able to be heard. We want to strive for that solution oriented. We're dealing with some big problems here. Some of these solutions might feel really, really big. Some of them might not feel big enough, but let's stay solution oriented. And always welcoming for asking for clarification and challenging those assumptions, including your own. If you're not sure what somebody said or what somebody meant, please ask. And then I'm going to now go through all 5 of the slides and then come back to the first one and start again. So this is the first one we're going to look at is the payment models that prioritize full cost recovery. So what we've got in here is requiring the 15% de minimis. This is to ensure that there is stable admin across all grants and contracts, regardless of color of money. This does not preclude an organization if they already have a NICRA, if they already have a negotiated indirect cost rate, they would still be able to utilize that. And that when there are caps on admin funds, that departments shall not keep admin funds at the expense of their nonprofit partner. They still have to ensure that their contractee or their grantee is made whole for that 15%. Next one is beginning that tracking of payment. So one thing that we did learn is that we're not sure. We have only kind of like reflective information from organizations who report not getting paid on time, but we don't actually have as consistent of data around that as possible. So one of those options there is to introduce inconvenience payments. So when invoices are not paid on time, that there's an additional fund provided. Also in light that oftentimes organizations may have to take on debt in order to float the government. So being able to make that money back so that doesn't come out of service dollars. We could also be looking at advance payments. This would greatly limit issues with payments that come from reimbursements. And then also needing to do some additional research to do like a gap analysis for ongoing bodies of work. So one of the things we don't want to do is create new rules for the future and leave a bunch of old contracts living in the old world where they don't get the benefit of new efficiencies that are brought in. Procurement practices that support living wages. So we've got a few different options here. Some of these can work together. Some of them might not be able to work together. One is establishing that prevailing wage standard. So kind of the way I understand the difference between the prevailing wage and the wage board, wage and standards board, is that the prevailing wage would really set those wages by practitioner or body of work, like work type. And it would really be connected to the contract itself. This standard could also then provide that guidance for calculating wage allocations for agencies that do the line item budgeting, where you have your wages spelled out differently from the other bodies of work. So we can figure out how are you ensuring that that minimum is making it into that budget. And also be able to provide guidance on other types of wage compliance within those contracts, especially if you're doing advance payment where you're not doing the line items. The Wage and Standards Board would more be a standard that's set for the sector, essentially regardless of what type of contract or what color of money. And this would also provide those standards. So this would be a way of, instead of nonprofits all individually negotiating for what minimum should be in those line items, the Wage and Standards Board would actually help to set that. So we would be looking back to them to make sure that the contract is compliant with the wage board. So then us as the organization can be compliant as the organization. And this could also be the place in where we calculate that COLA and inflation adjustment that should happen in the following years. Another option is to utilize prospective budgeting. And so this would be when that contract managers are actually obtaining estimates for future service costs and being able to work that into their budget. So then when they're told, here's how much you're either allowed to ask for, how much your department's going to be approved for, instead of them taking that back to the organizations and saying, okay, this is how much is in your contract. What they have done first is they've asked, if we want to maintain this work, how much is it going to cost? If we want to increase this work, how much is it going to cost? If we want to decrease this work, how much is it going to cost? And then when they get their budget estimates, can actually say, so based on this much money, this is how much service we can purchase. And then they're able to actually move that forward so that decision makers are able to see that a flat, for example, like a flat funding would actually equate to maybe a 10% decrease in outcomes. So that everyone has much better information because we're doing prospective budgeting rather than waiting for all the budgets to be finalized and then trying to shoehorn our programs into them. For the uniform application for grants, one of the options is to look at a statewide grant management database platform. So we know that some agencies already have something or in process with a vendor. It sounds like luckily some are using the same vendor. So maybe this isn't too complicated to take what's been built and expand it out to those agencies who have not had the benefit of this kind of device. This could actually also create a pre-application process where organizations are creating a profile of all that required information that's always needed for any application so that it's stored and regularly available to both procurement and program staff. So it try to end some of that duplication of submitting the same information over and over. This would also provide a place for us to store a lot of information. A few things that we heard in our subcommittees was needing to make sure we know how to ask for technical assistance, how to escalate issues, where the payments are being tracked, how can I get updates on where my payment is, reporting templates and permanently publishing some of those templates and guides so that I'm not waiting until after I've gotten an award to then be given the template to then figure out if I can actually comply with the reporting requirements, but they're published all the time. I know exactly what I'm getting into before I apply. Establishing a program year. We talked about kind of like offsetting this from the fiscal year in order to create the time that's necessary. We heard it at the beginning of the meeting. A lot of what we heard is that the amount of steps that are involved for the state agencies for them to do a clear, responsible process gets squished a lot with unrealistic expectations. And so if we move into a program year, for example, a January to December, we essentially buy 6 months of time that is clearly needed to start a procurement process or update contracts so that nonprofits know that for the first half of the fiscal year, I'm operating under my previous year contract. And for the second half of the fiscal year, I'm then operating under my new contract. And this introduces that time. Maintaining consistent open periods. Now that we have that 6 months, we can actually have some more standardization instead of everyone kind of essentially trying to steal time. And then creating a new set of administrative rules. So I want to pull this one back just to mention from the NAO presentation. Their recommendation here would actually be a new statute with administrative rules to follow. So if we were to say, just talk about the administrative rules, we would essentially be kind of punting to the legislature on the question of where in the statute are these rules connected, or we could just elevate this and make the recommendation for a new statute with rules to follow. This is where we could house a lot of this information around providing guidance for payments and also when to use a grant versus when to use a contract. I think one of the key factors we need to kind of get into our minds is that grants are really contributions to work, where contracts are purchasing unique and closed access work. We're using these things oftentimes interchangeably. I might get a grant that says I can only serve a certain population of people, regardless of what my organization might have been doing before I got that grant or what I will be doing after that grant is spent. And so those kinds of constraints aren't usually aligned with good grant work. Also, the different payment systems that go with contracts don't always go with grants. This is a way of kind of just differentiating these two things better, and also could hold the other language for some of our other recommendations. Then we're going to take a look at our standard contract language. So this is when we're looking at a stakeholder review of all those templates and training materials, really trying to pull that language to be better aligned with nonprofit business practices. I think this is something Amanda also talked about, that a lot of those templates are really geared towards, making sure the government is getting a good competitive price from, a suite of plumbers. It was never built to solve homelessness, to address poverty, to support our elders. And so, how do we update that language so that it's capable of being reflective of the work we're actually doing? And then there's some additional recommendations here on actual language that should be in the contracts. One of those, clearly delineating which terms are negotiable. I think there's a misconception that nonprofits are just not negotiating. This is the same kind of thing that gets put on workers. It's their fault for not negotiating more for wages. It's nonprofits' fault for not negotiating more in their contracts. But we also know that not everything is actually negotiable in those contracts. So making sure it's very clearly delineated for the organization what they can negotiate and when they cannot negotiate. Ensuring that the insurance requirements, things that are beyond kind of standard business practices, things that come out of that DAS risk matrix are actually part of the funding award. I think this will also help state agencies to get a sense of, when they fill out that matrix, how much that actually costs. What we learned is that the cost for that insurance is divorced from the decisions about requiring those insurance. And I think we really need to bring those back so that we understand the costs that we're all taking on. I kind of think to Rep. Conrad's comments about trade-offs, we have no idea what the trade-offs are with those insurance requirements, because as far as the agency is concerned, they're free and they can check all the boxes they want. And then for the nonprofit, trying to fill those requirements can get really costly. So collapsing those processes essentially to make sure that they're part of the same process, and we actually know the cost of those insurance requirements and that they're part of the contract award. Again, if it's above and beyond what standard business practice is, standard business practice is on us. Also introducing when advance payment should be required. So this is also looking at when you should be using advance payment, when advance payment is an option and should be in the contract versus when it's reimbursement only. One of the key things here is that reimbursement only contracts, that are continuing to try to limit access to a program, if the contract is not paying 100% of the program and the organization is already subsidizing that contract from other funders, whether it's individual donations from the community, philanthropy, or another government agency. As soon as they have to subsidize that contract, they should be able to also say, we're going to serve a greater diversity of people to essentially support the other funders and the other community members who don't fit in to the limited access that comes with this contract. This will help also differentiate between the state agency maybe thinking they're buying all the slots in a program to realistically what you can actually afford to purchase. Maybe you can only afford to purchase 60 slots of the program. I have to subsidize you by finding other funders for the 40%. So now instead of subsidizing you, what I'm actually doing now is I'm pairing you with another funder for the same program. And that 40%, I can change the eligibility requirements for that other 40%, maybe even take different types of referrals and things like that. So really trying to open up opportunities for organizations to be more flexible when they have to fundraise to support a program when a contract is not going to pay for it. And then looking at our sufficient reporting. So this is trying to also figure out ways to bring in the cost of reporting into the body of work, and just try to make sure we're having a better sense of that some things can and 100% fit into the admin rate. And then there are other types of reporting that is above and beyond that does actually require a whole different set of staff time to do. And so making sure that that analysis is part of the request in the procurement, that it's clear what types of reporting are being requested and what types of reporting come with additional funds and which types of reporting are expected to be part of the admin rate. And then for any programs that are trying to show change over time in participant outcomes, moving to these 3 to 5 year commitments, unless it's explicitly a pilot program. And that is what we're going to go through. So going back to our first one, let's start chatting. So thoughts, who would like to kick us off with their thoughts on this first one? All right, Marianne.
I find it very interesting because just this last week we got some money through Lane County from OHCS, and it said right on it, OHCS admin rate is 8%. So it's very interesting to me that a certain agency within the state can say, yeah, it's not 15, it's 8.
So are you supporting some of the language in here?
Yes, I definitely want the NICR or 15% de minimis.
Okay. Katrina, I see you next.
I just want to clarify, are we saying that this is going to be the official standard of requiring a 15% de minimis rate or a minimum? Because I would, if we are saying the first, I would like to request the latter, which is requiring a minimum of a 15% de minimis admin rate. Because I know in some cases and in some state agencies, there is a negotiation process where you are able to increase your admin rate if you can show a demonstrable need.
Okay. Thank you for that add. So minimum and still allowing for additional negotiation. Go for it, Bettina.
I just had a question. I wanted to have that first bullet point clarified. I'm not 100% sure what we are trying to achieve there.
Oh, yes. So we have heard that, there are some funds that come that are not state general funds, where there may be some sort of legislative limitation on administrative funds. So in those cases, one of the options would be to structure it as general operating. So effectively, you don't separate out all the different line items in the budget, because I think that's when we get that squish where we're trying to pay for all of the things that are needed to run the program. But if we can't have like a line item that says X number of percentage or things like that, when you structure it as general operating, you have more flexibility in where those dollars go. You're still held to the same outcomes. But that was just a thought of trying to, I think, be conscious that there may be limitations imposed on dollars that are out of the state's control.
Okay, yeah, maybe I would put that point as the last then, rather than the first.
Any other thoughts? What do we like or not like about these pieces? And we can also remove things if we're just like, that's too nuanced.
Can we tie it to the OMB rule so that it adds, as that changes, the state's changes? Is updated.
Okay, so instead of calling out the 15%, just say that all grants and contracts, regardless of source of funds, should at a minimum adhere to the OMB de minimis.
I think that would be good.
Okay.
I think that's smart, Marianne, to follow over time so it doesn't become irrelevant.
Should it be like or 15%? I guess I'm worried about it. I don't know if it would ever go down. I don't know if the government would ever be like, never mind, we're going back to 10%. And yeah, that's what's coming to mind. Maybe I'm paranoid.
So in my experience, since 2010, it's gone from 7 to 10, and now this last year it was changed to 15. So I think tying it to that, just like the mileage rate, is helpful for nonprofits.
I don't think it's ever gone down in history. I don't know, though.
I think saying 15% or OMB de minimis, whichever is greater, would make sense.
Go ahead, Debbie.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I don't have a suggestion, but I have a concern. And that is on the last bullet around departments shall not keep admin funds at the expense of nonprofit partners. I understand what we're trying to achieve. I'm worried about how that's measured or implemented. And it seems a little subjective, the way it's written. So maybe we could develop a methodology or anyway, I like I said, I don't have a suggestion, but I think we would need to tighten up that bullet a little bit so that it could be measured consistently.
Okay. So I think part of that is like if the state gets a federal grant that comes with, you know, a 15% admin. And so then the state agency says, so we're going to keep 10 and you get 5. That's what we're trying to disrupt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what if the state keeps 5 and only gives 10 to the nonprofit, and then is that at the expense of the nonprofit?
I agree with you, Debbie. Yeah. I think it needs to be further defined.
Okay.
Because it's too subjective.
Mm-hmm.
Could we, I mean, I feel like I don't think we're in a position to say like, you know, that the agencies can't take a percentage, but regardless of what they take, it shouldn't impact the admin funds of the nonprofit. Whether they take 5, 15, 27, that's a whole different discussion. It doesn't impact the 15% minimum that they're required to get.
I think even saying that would be that the departments could not retain administrative funds until after the 15% was allocated to the nonprofits or something like that, I think would be helpful.
Go ahead, Heather.
Well, I'm thinking kind of a similar thing around, I feel like having seen legislation pass and then see it implemented, it's not the same thing unless we're crystal clear on what it looks like. And the second bullet even causes me some concern. So it's like, so some could get 30%. Like that could be problematic. And so I just wonder do we have to go into the last 2 bullets on the first section? Like, how important is that to us? Or are we saying you will pay 15% regardless? Like, or the federal de minimis, like if we change the language? Because when you start getting into these nuances, everything becomes an exception to the rule, and then it continues to be confusing and complicated, and every state agency gets to do it different. And that's what concerns me about, if not A, B, if not C, W, right? So I would vote for getting rid of those second 2 bullets and just say they're required to pay us the federal de minimis or 15%, whichever is more, period. Like, yeah, clean, clear, no confusion.
And I think if we go with the language around aligning with the OMB standard is what has these 2 options, either the de minimis or the negotiated rate. And so we could essentially roll that up and just say like we're meeting that same standard. Because getting a negotiated rate is not a small body of work, right? It's a big body of work. And so if an organization has gotten to the point where they have that negotiated rate, disallowing them from using it actually feels a little wrong.
Although,
but I think we
like a
can.
community college can get up to 30% because they have facilities to pay for. But if the grant that they're delivering on doesn't include their pool, why do they get their de minimis on that? I don't know. I struggle with that. But I'm open.
Let's see. I see another hand. Teresa. I'm also not monitoring the chat, so if I just want to, because I have too many screens open. So if you're making suggestions in the chat, I highly recommend you say it out loud. Go ahead, Teresa.
Yeah, thank you. I can't actually use the chat for some reason, but that's okay. What I wanted to point out is that even the state has some federal money that comes in with lower rates. We have a Title 20 where 9% is the indirect rate on that. So are we talking about, in those instances, we still have to get more money to backfill that rate so that the nonprofits have 15%? And that's just a question I have in my head when we talk about regardless of source of funds. And then the other piece that we're working through right now, as we're working with tribal nations on their indirect rates, is how we budget. If we do talk about, I saw something in the chat about what about using the grantee's rate. If we start going to using their negotiated indirect, budgeting becomes more complex because we're having to look at each and every individual grantee and what is their indirect, and then how do we do our agency request budget at that point? None of those are all the things going through my head that I just want to put out there for people to think about. I don't have actually an answer or response to that.
Thank you, Teresa. Rep. Conrad.
Thanks, I appreciate it. And I wish I could remember what's bugging me. It's the 15%. There's something in the legislative process about pegging it to the Fed rate, and for someone like the tax code, they periodically have to go back and they have to pass bills to reconnect it, and they have to choose to reconnect it. So just setting expectations, if there's an attorney that understands that process a little bit different, because the 15% or might create a problem, or it might be the solution instead of an and. So just the verbiage and setting those expectations, but there's something about that legislative process to keep things connected to the federal rate. If the word OMB is in there, or the phrase OMB is in there.
So you're saying that if we roll it up to just say that at a minimum, the OMB de minimis standard must be offered, agencies can allow negotiations above that if work requires additional consideration. So you're saying to say the 15% and the OMB de minimis, or where? I'm sorry, I missed where you're wanting to put that and.
Where I was going. Yeah. So if it's, I would say 15%, and then have some qualifier in there about it can go higher if the legislature decides to tag it to the OMB, but that's got to be a bill by bill, because there has to be a connection there. And I in going through, and again, I wish I knew more about it, but like in the Revenue Committee, when they redo it and they connect to the federal tax code, there was a way that they did it, and they pegged it for a certain reason, but they have to, every couple of years or periodically, they have to go reconnect it to the tax code. And so it is an affirmative decision. So to put it in there, I don't know what those consequences are, but I just want to set that expectation, just be concerned with that verbiage. And when presentations are ultimately done before a committee on all this, just so you know, here's what we're trying to do, here's what we prefer. But if it's too complicated, if we have to redo this every 2 years, maybe not, but we at least want the baseline standard. So if that makes sense, I would keep 15%, keep that in there, and just be loose on how it gets connected if it's chosen to get connected to OMB. Does that make sense? Have a solid floor, but be flexible on that upper end because of some of the legislative processes.
Okay. So right now, 15 is the OMB standard. So we would be, we would actually, I think if we do it that way, and I'd love a little, pushback if I'm thinking about this wrong. If we put in 15%, then that I think would actually trigger the needing to have the legislature update it every time the OMB updates it. But if we set it to the OMB, shouldn't that mean that then when agencies are building their budgets, they just have to go look? Or is it a question of whether this is in statute or whether this is a rule?
All those are good questions, and I don't know the answer enough. I'm raising that concern. I would set 15%. I would, even you say at least 15%, whatever that right verbiage is. So you set that floor, but not necessarily tag it to what that OMB rate is, to be flexible on that.
Okay.
Hopefully I didn't make it more confusing.
No, I think it's going to be, a little bit of a difference of opinion. We're going to have to consolidate around, because the OMB is not going to change a lot. Like, it was a big deal that it changed. But I'm hearing some people in this space wanting to connect it to that so that we don't have to update the language every time the federal government might change something. But I'm hearing you say a consistent floor, regardless of what the OMB is easier as far as legislative language goes.
Yes.
Okay.
And even, even if, and I don't know what the right level, if it'd be statute or rulemaking or where it'd be, but permissive, that the legislature could do it, could increase that based off of whatever they want. But to set that floor, make it a solid floor, and then be permissive for what happens on that upper end of it.
Okay. Bettina?
Yeah, just thinking back about the presentation we had earlier today, where there was a recommendation of creating these standards for grants. So that's where they could potentially live in the long term. Those rules that we're making a recommendation now, but that sort of will also be picked up in our more long-term recommendation, that there be potentially some grant OERs or whatever they are going to be that are applying. Because I like having it connected and then automatically updating.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other comments on the 15% de minimis, or how we'd like that language to show up? Or any comments on the next section about consistent tracking of payments? And then kind of what do we do with the data as we start to get it, is kind of what those other bullet points are about. Go ahead, Bettina.
So on the next one, I think one of the words that I think we would suggest we change is the proper implementation. Allow for proper implementation. That doesn't give me much. I don't know if it's what we're trying to say isn't 100% clear to me there in that word. And then I wonder for the inconvenience fees or interest, if we want to connect it to something, like, for example, what gets charged in small claims court to, so that the government, uses its own rates to penalize itself.
What about timely program implementation and instead of proper?
Go ahead, Katrina.
Just responding to the last comment about timely program implementation on the part of the government agency conducting the procurement, or timely program implementation on the nonprofit who's receiving the money trying to implement a program.
So I think I was saying the reason this happens is because we have the biennium and then we don't get money for a while. We don't have the budget. We don't have any funds, but yet we're supposed to keep continuing the program. So
oh, right. Okay.
Maybe continuation
I see what you're saying.
instead of
Okay.
timely.
I see what you're saying. The other thing, that was just a response to the question that Marianne posed. But the other thing I was going to mention here as a potential amendment is some language around, I don't know if we want to get this deep, but the specificity of what the inconvenience fee entails, particularly for agencies who may have to draw on like a line of credit or something like that that requires interest payments above and beyond whatever the contract may be quote unquote reimbursing, that then the agency has to eat the interest for because of the charges against those dollars. So just something for folks to think about.
Go ahead, Dolly.
This is Dolly England, she, her queen. I'm trying to be so quiet in the background, but I gotta say this. What you just described is actually what we're exploring in contracts, and it's really specific to the contract and the amendment. And you're right, there's a period where we have to wait for the legislature to decide how much money our agency is going to get, and then a little bit more time for the agency to decide which divisions and programs will get what money, and that takes time. So we're exploring a 3-year contract with what we're calling a bridge period, where CBOs are still able to get a monthly payment based on what we assume is a stable budget. Like, we're going to get as much as we got last year, and we can then start planning and award some funds to CBOs before we actually get that money from the legislature. It's really complicated and hard, and not every state agency is going to be able to do it. But I do think looking at 3-year contracts as opposed to 2-year contracts with the biennium ending is going to be better for CBOs.
That is great. And if we don't remember to bring that up when we get to the other slide that has the program year thing, let's remember that example. I'm saying that aloud so I don't forget, because I think that goes along with the idea behind that as well, is like how to create that time that maintains some consistency while we're waiting for like what is just very natural process to move forward. Okay. Any other comment here? Okay, I'm going to move to the next one. We'll chat here for a little while, then we'll take a break, and then we'll come right back into it. I do have some like amended language that I'm working on as we're talking, and I'll bring that back for us to take a look at when we. I'm trying to decide if I should come back at the break or hold on. Maybe I'll bring this at the break so that maybe we get a couple of those before we move on. But all right, the big one, wages. So this is where I think we started to hear a little bit from NAO on these particular buckets about the prevailing wage or the wage standard, and definitely have some discussion opportunities here around those kind of trade-offs. So again, my kind of understanding of the difference between prevailing wage and the Wage and Standards Board is that the prevailing wage would really be connected to a particular body of work and a particular contract. So by taking this contract and agreeing to this work, we are paying this wage for the people who are connected to this work, versus a Wage and Standards Board, which would be looking at setting those standards, looking at the whole sector, so that when we then go in to apply for a grant, we're like, this is the minimum that we are requesting for this body of work, as the guidance from the Wage and Standards Board has provided. And then the prospective budgeting, so this is trying to look at how we provide agencies with that information about how much they can actually purchase before they get their budgets, so that when they get their budgets, they know clearly this amount of money buys me this amount of service, instead of waiting until after to then tell agencies this is how much we got for the services that you've already agreed to do, and now have to do them under this constraint. So it's just trying to kind of reorder the process of things. I think that practice could align with probably either of the prevailing wage or wage and standards board, but I'm not sure. I don't think the prevailing wage and the wages and standards board necessarily go together, but they may. Maybe it's that the wage and standards board sets the prevailing wage. But let's talk about it. Marianne.
So I placed in the chat at 9:52 a.m. a piece of our preschool promise contract where it actually shows, based on the qualification level of a teacher and assistant, what the target, what they'd like to target the salary at and what the minimum salary is. That's actually written into our contract. I think that either the Wages and Standard Board would be a better idea if it was set by, are you an accountant? Are you a teacher? Are you a, whatever you do, by that qualification or that job description, what the target and the minimum would be. I think that would be fabulous.
Okay. Other thoughts on the pros and cons? Go ahead, Bettina.
Yeah, I think priority-wise, the wages and standard board for me will probably be the priority one. For prevailing wages, I think the impact question comes to me, we've already alluded to it earlier, just to really saying, if we're doing a prevailing wage, would we recommend doing an impact analysis before we set one? Because we don't want to cut services in 50%, because now we're setting the prevailing wages at a level that the state can only buy half of what they previously purchased. So I think the wage and standard board for me is more of like, look at the competition, look at what's happening, and look at what we've heard before. We're 5% down to, so what is it really that the competition is paying, or what similar jobs get paid? The prevailing wage for me is sort of a little bit more crude, because it is more static rather than it will change over time, because the prevailing wage and standard board, I would see like almost at the moment, making annual adjustments to those by looking at the market. But prevailing wages is more like the minimum wage, and I'm really worried about the overall impact. If it's like with the preschool promise things, they were set at a level that were never funded in the contract. So it made really very little sense to have these standards when we could never deliver the services at those costs. So that's where I think an analysis, if we do prevailing wage recommendations, I would make a recommendation to do an analysis as they're being set, so we don't have unintended consequences. Very negative. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I appreciate that call out, that it's like it's not just on the organization to create this role and pay that wage. It has to be connected to the contract negotiation and the budget limitations. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's an unfunded mandate. And I will say, just like a global comment around this question of like, are we going to lose services? I think we are losing services right now, y'all. I think we are right now being not as efficient, not as consistent, and not delivering the outcomes our community deserves, and even what I think our legislators think that they're paying for, because we are riding people too thin. We give them way too big caseloads. We have unrealistic deadlines. Like, I think right now we're not getting what we're paying for. And if we actually paid closer to what the services cost, we would see people in their positions much longer, gaining that really critical information about how to serve their community best. They would have more of a stable life that allows them to actually be in a caring role. We wouldn't have gaps in programs. We wouldn't have as much turnover. Like, we would actually hit our outcomes better. Like, why I guess would say I'm not worried about some like scary compression, because I think what we're doing right now is not getting us to what we think we're buying. And that if we were actually prepared to pay closer to what it actually costs to do the work, we'd get a ton better work out of it. Rep Conrad.
Thanks, Mercedes. And I don't disagree with anything that you say, that you just said. And I would hope that if some of the other things are actually passed for efficient systems, that the money within the system can just be rolled over into the wages to help offset some of whatever these costs are going to be, that the system's going to be able to do that. And that money is going to be able to go to some of these wages. That one of the things that, just thinking through how to operationalize some of this, the broad sector of nonprofits throughout the state, and just looking at what pay equity did in terms of classifications, jobs, and how much inefficiency it added, and how long it takes for the state to actually approve positions, and even at local levels, how long it takes for HR to do things. Would you want, or do you see, any of these things being compartmentalized by sector? So whether you had human services, whether you had environmental, whether you had what other nonprofit sectors are out there, so that somebody doesn't have to try and relate somebody that's a QMHP to what does that mean for somebody that does well testing, for somebody that does something else in a nonprofit that the state contracts with, just to try to keep it somewhat contained and make it as efficient as possible, given that it's going to add a certain level of inefficiency if they have to do broadband comparisons to make sure that there's level setting throughout those. So that's just my concern, is what would that look like in words on a page to not add inefficiencies to a system that we're trying to make more efficient? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Because you want it high level enough that everyone can see themselves in it, but not so high level that no one knows how it applies to them. So like creating a subsector lens so that when you're looking at this as the nonprofit as well as the state agency, which body of work this falls into. So it has to align with kind of how we understand different bodies of work now, for folks to be able to see themselves in it.
Yes, and yeah. No.
Go ahead, Katrina.
Thank you. Definitely want to give a +1 to that recommendation on prevailing wage and wages and standard boards by sector or type of work, group of work. Because I think that is critically important. The other thing I wanted to, oh Lord, I lost my train of thought. I hate it when this happens. I wanted to just specify that I do think in that same vein around trying to make sure that we make it large enough that it doesn't create significant inefficiencies, but also micro level enough that people can see themselves in it, is to maybe we should specify not to go to the level of like job type. And the reason why I say that is because I've seen other jurisdictions attempt to do that, to say, well, this class of work who, is performing outreach duties or specific to people who are experiencing homelessness that have a title of A, B, C, D, E, E, F, G, H, I should make this much. People who have this kind of job title in this particular sector should make this much. I do think we should be specific in saying that we can't get to that level, because that adds a level of that specifically speaks to Representative Conrad's concerns around inefficiencies, and it taking way too long to actually execute contracts or determine what a prevailing wage would be, and therefore elongating the process in general. So I don't know what that language will look like, but I would like to include something that cautions against that. or maybe even doesn't allow us to get to that level. Because there has to be some level of discretion for agencies making those calls. An outreach worker in one agency may be doing something completely different than an outreach worker in a different agency.
Mm-hmm. So I hear that and I agree. I think, job titles are mostly made up. So kind of connecting to job titles also could create like loopholes for an organization if it's looking to like not comply with standards, right? They just create different job titles that don't appear in the list, right? And that's not what we're trying to do. We're actually trying to get more consistency. So not down to the level of job title, a subsector, but it sounds like maybe connecting it to, I'm trying to kind of pull from that, Katrina, how specific, so like is human services specific enough, or are we talking about something more detailed than that, like human services with certifications, human services with licenses, human services without certifications or licenses? Is that specific enough?
Maybe, yeah. Or human services, domestic violence, human services, homelessness, human services, child protective, youth work, youth services, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I don't even think I would go to the level of with credentialed or not. It just gets so complicated real fast once we start trying to get to. Yes, I'm with you, Holly. It is nerve-wracking, and I've seen it happen. Multnomah County did this not too long ago. So
yeah, and I also just coming from an agency that does a lot of multi-generational work and holistic models, that like I don't think I could separate out like my domestic violence from like my youth providers, right? Like they're going to be in the same program trying to do work together. So that almost is too detailed for me too.
Right.
So,
yeah. So probably the human services versus, I can't think of any other at this moment. But yeah.
Well, like education, healthcare.
Right.
Okay. Let's keep marinating. Marianne, go ahead.
So I dropped into the chat a link to the 2022 salaries and benefits. It's a report from the state of Oregon. It shows every single job title. If you look on page 105, you have an accountant 1, then you have an accountant 2, accountant 3, financial analyst 1, 2, 3, that kind of thing. So I don't see why we couldn't use that report that shows an average of what those people are paying to use it for the wage board. And I don't think it's something we need to figure out, but it does, that information already exists at the state of Oregon level, and it might be helpful when they decide what they're going to do on that for a wage board.
Yeah. And I think what we're hearing, Marianne, is that for some of us, that is too, like, is my accountant equal to a state accountant 1, 2, 3? Is my organization's staff roles aligned enough to use that kind of standard? Like, I think that although it's great that that information exists, we're not the nonprofit sector isn't a single employer who can put everybody under consistent job titles or job roles, right? So I think that's the complicating factor there, is that like we're trying to figure out how to be specific enough that it's clear for people if they're included in this or not, but not so specific that I would have to go back to my HR department and we'd have to change all of our job titles to try to figure out how to align. Like, we're not trying to do that.
See, and I was thinking it was helpful because it's all there, it's all done, and we have the data. and there's probably a job description that says you're an accountant one when you have this much experience and this much education. You know, the job description would match.
I
Go
think
ahead, Heather.
that's what I'm specifically trying to warn against. Just because it can get real sticky real fast, depending on what kind of agency you're engaging with, depending on what kind of agency is doing the work, whether they're culturally specific or not, how large they are, how small they are. Yeah, I feel the temptation though, because it seems like it would be much easier to do so. It's just it never shakes out that way across CBOs. Never. I haven't seen it happen once.
I concur with Katrina. And I also have to say that we are a nonprofit, but we also do a lot of subcontracts and we fund a lot of organizations. And we've actually had a really hard time getting some of the organizations we fund to increase wages because of exactly some of the things like Dolly brought up where there's multiple grants. So maybe we allow for more for wages, but other grants don't. And we're kind of not paying attention to the fact that there are boards of directors that make decisions and directors that make decisions within nonprofits. And to require certain things may not fit for some nonprofits. So I feel like it seems like it should be easy, like Katrina said, but I think this is so devil in the details. And I'm really worried if we put forth something that if we come up with a wage and standards board, how much is that going to cost us to implement and manage and oversee? Are we creating more and more structures that are just going to cost us more and more money? Like everything we're talking about, there's a financial impact. So.
Mm-hmm. And so again, I think these are good reflections. And how do we then get to something that ensures that an organization is not intentionally underfunding their staff and an agency is not intentionally underfunding an agency, making it hard for them to reach livable wages, right? So this has to be something that has an accountability factor on both sides, something that is actionable. I will say, I think we can very easily say that this is a recommendation that would require another body of work, right? It's not going to be, we're not going to have all the details worked out in whatever we submit. What we're doing is pointing in a direction to say, in order to get to a point where you don't have unfunded mandates and where you don't have a race for the bottom, do this, right? And so we're trying to fill in the blank. Go for it, Bettina.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. We're not talking about competitive wages. What we're tasked for is more like the bottom, the living wages, because I still think, living wages is not enough, but living wages is the first mandate. And then we want to get to competitive wages where all the detail might count. So I think a standard wage and standards board for me will create transparency. We don't have transparency at the moment. And we don't have single guidance for all departments. So that's where the beauty of the Wage and Standards Board for me is, or prevailing wage, is that all state departments get the same guidance or overall guidance rather than they pick what they want to pick. So there's that transparency that then links it to living wages as the bottom, and then has also some upwards guidance for competitive wages. So we don't have those 5 to 12% difference. We shrink those. Yeah.
And so I did hear, I think Katrina say, maybe don't love connecting it with like certain certifications or licenses. That did come up in our subcommittee discussions. One of the other things that came up in the subcommittee discussions was connecting it to positions that have to pass certain state background checks. That like if the state requires this position pass a background check, the state must also guarantee that that position has a minimum of X wage. So that's one way we can kind of look at it, that it's not position type, it actually is type of work. Are there other things like that, or do people like that kind of idea of where to create an identification for like who's in and what the floor is? Go ahead, Marianne.
So for me, one of our hardest positions to hire for are peer support or case managers or housing navigators to work with unhoused folks. So we're constantly scrambling to get them, to keep them, to retain them, to train them, all of that. And right now, if you have a mental health qualification or you have substance use background, you're more desirable, but you're also at $30, right? So to have something that said that position with the designation of the mental health qualified provider would be something valuable that we could actually put in the budget and say, City of Eugene, we're going to be hiring somewhere close to $28 to $30 for these positions because we want to give you the outcomes you want. We want to be successful.
Go ahead, Rep. Conrad.
I appreciate the discussion. And Marianne, you just brought up something. One of the other complicating factors is regionality and what it looks like in Portland compared to what it looks like in Burns for some of these. So not only sector, but if when the recommendation happens or when the presentation happens in discussion, somehow tying it to like a QMHP, what would Lane County pay at QMHP? And to have more of a qualitative purpose, or at least part of that discussion of tying it to what the local government would pay an equivalent position. Just another thought so that we address regionality. And then also, if also to Marianne's point about the government job descriptions, they're there, they've done it. And so if there's just a way to qualitatively say what the purpose is and somehow connect those two things, that might help achieve some of these goals.
Mm-hmm. I think some of it's difficult because I think some of the reason that nonprofit organizations are contracted with because there is no like government equivalent, right? Like it actually is community-based work. And then I will say I personally have a little bit of heartburn about the regionality because I'm not sure that I agree that people who live in different places are doing any less work or that their work is worth less because they live in a place that costs less to live or because other employers pay people less in that community. I want us to, I'm wary of devaluing the work by saying in some places you can pay, $5 to $10 less than you would pay for the same body of work in another place. And I would actually suspect that those places where we think people should get paid less is really based on perception. And also maybe not recognizing that, like, say, like in an urban setting in Portland where we have a lot of very expensive cost of living, where you may justify paying somebody more, may also be on a team of like 3 different case managers. Whereas in a smaller community that we consider to be less costly, that we might consider paying that person less, they are the only case manager. They have no backup because there is not enough work for there to be 3 of them. I think that person is working just as hard, if not harder, sometimes if they don't have a team, right? Just because their population is different and their work requirements are different, but it's the same body of work. So I would be hesitant about writing in a recommendation that would regionalize the wages. Yeah. I also think that housing costs are becoming global and like it literally doesn't matter where you live. You're going to pay as much rent as they can possibly get out of you. All right, so I don't feel like we have I think we have much more clarity on the first slide from the payment models, and I might bring that back after we take a quick break here. I'm not feeling like we have a lot of clarity on the living wages, so I might move us to the next one and not show you all where I think that we are. But let's take a 5-minute break. So everyone back at 10:50, and then I'll show you what I think I have for the payment models, and then we'll jump into the uniform application. right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Okay. I'm going to put up our first slide here. This is jumping back to our payment models that prioritize full cost recovery. I want everyone just to take a look and let me know where you are, green, yellow, or red.
Mercedes, what do you mean by stack?
Oh, yeah, let's fix that. Oh, it's a better way to say it.
I'm wondering
So
if
what I'm trying to, go ahead,
sorry, you
Bettina.
go first.
So what I'm trying to say is what will sometimes happen is like if my May invoice has a discrepancy, and the agency wants to go through it with me, they'll also hold up my June invoice when that comes in, and then they'll also hold up my July invoice when that comes in. And that's not consistent. Some agencies will continue to review and just hold up the one that has the discrepancy. So it's more trying to get into like that timely payment that I think for nonprofits, why we would consider if you didn't review my June because you were holding up on my May, and then the June was fine, there was no discrepancies, but now we're late paying that because of the May one. Now it kind of brings confusion into that question of like, so do you owe me the fee for June or not? And I would say you do, because you should have reviewed June when June came in while we're still working on getting you answers to your questions for the May one. So it's trying to kind of disrupt some of that practice. But like each invoice, if you're doing a reimbursement based, should be reviewed as they come in and paid as they are approved.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Bettina.
I was just wondering if instead of timely, we should say something in line with the grant or contract payment schedule, because timely is open for interpretation. But if we just say as as in the grant or contract payment schedule.
Go ahead, Helen.
Just curious about the fee for late payment and being tied to small claims court or debt. What do you have in mind there?
So those were two comments that were made. I think Bettina mentioned small claims court as the, so like my invoice was not paid on time, that I get the amount that is approved plus a fee on top of that. And the fee on top of that is set, the recommendation was either small claims court, or if I have had to take on debt in order to make
Oh.
payroll and complete, keep paying out what I owe, then I can use that debt to claim the fee.
Okay, yeah, I just want to make sure that the clarity of the language was not construed to say that a nonprofit would have to go to small claims court or to like take on additional work in order to enforce the fee.
Maybe we can use the statute. I'm just going to look it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you.
Hey, Mercedes, this is Charlie.
Yes.
On that one, do you want to put in a little more specific and say you can recover actual cost plus an administrative fee over and above? Because I think that's what you just said, right? Actual cost for whatever you incur, and then an administrative fee, a punitive aspect to it to encourage compliance in the future.
Can you say that again?
Actual costs. So whatever you incur as a cost for taking on debt or any other actual costs, and then administrative fee, because again, if you're going to have administrative work to track it to figure out where it's going to go. There's going to be back end stuff, so you can easily make that connection. But then that would get your two components of that you just mentioned.
Okay, I'm going to wait on this one. I think nobody put red, yellow, or green. So I feel like people are not ready to say where they are. So I'm going to move us to the next one, and then we'll come back. Okay, so this is where we have our uniform application procedures for grants. This is where we're trying to kind of separate our grants out from the contracts. We have our state grant management platform. A lot of those bullets underneath are kind of justifications or like things that the platform could do. I think we could probably simply say a single state grant management database platform. The program year, and then the administrative rule, again, calling back to our NAO presentation. This could also be a statute rather than just a set of administrative rules. Any thoughts?
I apologize. Are you asking us to vote?
Nope. Now we're going back to just discussion. So I had put out a vote for the first one, the payment models, but I didn't get any votes. So I'm moving us back into discussion with a new topic. Go ahead,
I think
Marianne.
go ahead, sorry.
So, by the pre-application organizational profile, are you talking about like management qualifications that lays out all the details that can then be used for any grant or contract?
It would contain all the minimum standard required information. So this would be, the state agencies would all have to agree, and I think we collected some feedback from them on what are the things that they always ask for. And what we'd be looking for is to consolidate among the things that each agency always asks for, that should then be an ability for an organization to build a profile in this database platform where they can put that information. So if you always ask for my 990, if you always ask for my board makeup, if you always ask for my mission and vision, like that would then live in the profile. So what specific information is not going to be detailed, I think, in this recommendation, because this would really be the state agencies collaborating to determine what it is that they all are all asking for that is consistent, that could be put into more of an agency profile instead of you having to upload that information every single time you apply for something new.
Right. So then you're just saying, I am contractor number 1, 2, 3, 4, then it would tie it to that, and then you wouldn't have to input that every time.
Exactly.
That's perfect.
The one question I had here was, do we want it for grants only, or do we want grants and contracts? What is our thought?
Yeah. So I think we can decide. The charter specifically said uniform application procedures for grants. So that's why it's titled this way. That's what was in our initial charge.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Go for it.
I was just going to say, I really like this one. I think that, a North Star has really been wages, and this just keeps coming up over and over again, regardless of where we're having the conversation and what it means for staff, time, effort, expertise. So I think this is an important one, and I hope a legislator takes it and runs with it. Thanks.
Okay. Any other thoughts either on the management or the grants management platform, the program year, or the administrative rules, creating a new set of administrative rules?
Could you explain the last one a little bit more? Because
yeah. So I think I'm going to actually pull on, I think, Amanda's example a lot. So one thing that we learned in this process, right, is that there is a set of procurement rules that are mostly focused on contracts. Sometimes they're used to help manage grants, but they're not really written to manage grants. And so what this would do would just create a separate set of rules that would be specific for grants. So kind of very clearly help to differentiate those two. And I have administrative rule in here because that's what came up in our subcommittee discussions. What we heard from NAO is that they think we almost need another level up. We need the statute. And I think the way this would work regardless is that administrative rules have to be attached to some kind of statute, whether that's an existing one or a new one. And so one thing we could say is create a new statute and administrative rule that specifically lays out these recommendations for grants. I think a bunch of the language that we're talking about and even other slides would eventually live in here, like the 15% piece, like would end up living in the administrative rule and in this particular statute. But what do folks think about that? If we say administrative rule, we're essentially kind of punting on the question of which statute it's connected to, either existing procurement statute or a new statute. If we say statute, it means we're actually asking the legislature to pass legislation and start this from essentially zero, right? Creating a whole new section of our code.
Is there a recommendation from state agencies on what might be easier, or from Rep. Conrad or someone else who is more familiar with that process?
Debbie, did you want to speak?
Can you restate what you were?
Yeah, so I think, so the question is, we have in our current slide, creating a new set of administrative rules and essentially being silent on which statute those are connected to. Or we could amend this language and actually say we want to see a new statute created with administrative rules to follow. And I think Heather was looking for thoughts from state agencies or legislators on what makes sense in that process. And then I saw Felicia's hand up before, but I wasn't sure if she was trying to answer the question. And then I saw Debbie's hand, and so I wasn't sure if you were trying to answer the question.
Yes.
I'm not qualified to answer the question. I have an opinion, but I'm not qualified to answer it.
So I can take a stab at it, and it's kind of an opinion rather than a qualified answer. But just for context, an agency can't create a new statute. You all know that has to go through legislative process. So a couple things there. It's the force. It becomes law, which is great, but it takes longer. We have to have, legislators that are willing and able to carry it. So we tend to prefer to do things through rule when we have a statute that we can sort of bolt onto and create rule underneath, because that's something that we can do on our own. It's a public process, but we have a lot more flexibility. And then if something's not working right, we can change the rule if we need to. So I would recommend that we be open to a statute change if we have someone who wants to promote that for us, but we also reserve the right to make our changes through administrative rule.
And so you feel like just stating creating a new set of administrative rules essentially allows that flexibility, right? Because if we identify a statute and connect to, great. If we don't and we need to create one, that'll happen anyway. Is that kind of?
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, Representative Conrad.
Thanks, I appreciate it. And so Debbie, also looking for your side on this from the agency side. If we have a discrete statute with rules built underneath it, anytime those rules need to be adjusted, it narrows what gets opened up and what gets under discussion. If we try to dovetail or force rules into a broad statute, when the rulemaking happens, you open up a whole bunch of other different things that could be under discussion and could create issues throughout that process. So if we want, and if the intent is to have something narrowly defined, have a statute, build the rules underneath it. So you've got the statute that says exactly what you want. And then if it ever needs to be changed, it's easier because you're just focusing on one statute that's related, as opposed to potentially bringing in a bunch of other different things. So Debbie, if I have any of that wrong, please go ahead and correct me.
No, I think you're accurate. If we choose to open an existing statute through legislation, then anything in that statute is subject to someone coming in and tinkering with it and changing it. So we do try to be careful when we open up existing. I think what you're suggesting, Rep. Conrad, is if we go the statute route to create a new one that's specific for this purpose.
Correct. Build what we want it to be and not try to force it where it really shouldn't be or other problems.
I think I lean towards a new law for a couple reasons. I think based on everything that's been shared and the opportunity to share with legislators about the difference between contracts and grants and have those conversations, that I think would be of value. And if I understand correctly, so much of the confusion has been that there isn't these very clear rules. So I think I lean towards it saying, but it sounds like even if we leave it as is, like based on what Debbie's saying, that it still might be a change to statute. So I don't know. I like the idea of a change big time.
We could, I think, maybe start with that higher level and say, create a new statute and accompanying administrative rules that are specific for grants management. At a minimum, ensure administrative rules are created that cover, and then we can kind of list some of those things. And so again, we're still kind of leaving it open to a legislator has to want to, or I suppose, there's also maybe some like I don't know if there's some like executive opportunity for the governor to say, I would like somebody to run this bill, but like, I think it also kind of opens it up to that if there is some administrative rules that can be created while we're waiting to see if a legislator is interested, those could happen. But then I feel like we're being almost too loose. I don't know. I started to say it and I'm taking it back as I'm saying. Sorry. Go for it, Bettina.
Yeah, I support the new administrative rules too. That I think we heard that earlier, and it just makes sense because it gives it more longevity, and it's not hidden somewhere else and as a subsection. So that's why I like that. In the second bullet point, though, we're still saying regular is it disbursement or reimbursements? Do we want to keep reimbursements in there, or when we say disbursement is forward paying rather than reimbursements? I wonder if we really wanted to come out against reimbursements and say they have to either disburse on a regular fee or prepay, or so we completely go away from reimbursement contracts in our recommendations.
I think for this one, the goal was to say that grants specifically should either be advance payment, and by regular disbursement, like a quarterly disbursement, like it's already scheduled. You'll get X amount cut up into X number of pieces. So I don't know if I think we'll have standard contract language coming up if we also want to push that for contracts. But I think for grants, to me, it's very obvious that grants are not contracts. Grants are not supposed to be fee for service like that. And so doing it reimbursement based is calling it a grant when you're clearly not treating it like a grant.
Okay.
I think a contract, maybe there's a reason for a reimbursement based contract. It's not my favorite. But I think being able to at least differentiate these and being very clear how grants should be operated differently than contracts at least helps us to move that away, understanding that contracts do cover more than nonprofits, right?
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. I wonder if in the third one we should put those late payment penalties in there, like as one of the bullets in the administrative rules. I can't do the chat, but I found the 9% in ORS 82.010 that is charged in small claims.
Any thoughts about the program year? Oh, this is when I want to remember Dolly's point. So Dolly was calling this bridge. She was calling this bridge funding, right? So we're at the end of the fiscal year. We're trying to move into the new fiscal year. Nobody has money yet, but everyone wants programs to keep going. So her example was just to do a bridge funding. What I put in the payment model one was essentially advancing the first quarter of the fiscal year. Or I feel like this program year differential is like an additional option. So the bridge sounded like just scheduled monthly payments while updating contracts or finalizing new contracts. The first quarter of the fiscal year is paid in advance. Or this program year, which creates this kind of 6-month window for all of that procurement. That one, I believe that it's fairly straightforward, but I don't know what the budget implications for the legislature might be, because effectively the legislature would be then approving funds for the last 6 months of a contract and the first 6 months of the next contract or grant agreement, rather in their minds where they're thinking like we're approving for just the fiscal year. But it would kind of change the perspective of like, what is you're actually approving. Part of it is work that's finishing, part of it is work that's starting. It's not all new work. And I think oftentimes legislators think when they're approving the budget, it's all like beginning in the fiscal year, even if it's ongoing, like it'll begin July 1. But we also know that none of this stuff gets done July 1, right? Because there's not enough time between June 30 and July 1. But any thoughts on that? What kind of bridge do people like? A first quarter payment, regular monthly payments, or actually just offsetting the timeline?
I prefer the overlap one that you talked about. So there's consistency and continuity over program years.
I can see both. We've had an extended year before, but then the new contract was late anyway. So, it just postponed the delay by a quarter. So sometimes the bridge funding seems an easier way there, saying we're going to give it to you. We'll give you 3 months to get the contracts underway. Because I've seen this just postponing rather than solving the issue by having another 3 months.
That if we have time, we just use that time and we
Yeah.
still run up to the deadlines.
Yeah, that's what happened. It just made the next it just delayed it by 3 months.
Okay. That's good. That's good to know how some of that shows up in practice. Because I know we've also heard from some state agencies trying to do that, trying to like have the contracts end like September, October, rather than June 30 to give that time. But if that time is then, if we're still seeing the crunch on the other end, like maybe the time isn't buying us what we think it's buying us, right? Like we think it's buying us consistency, but maybe it's not.
And if you think of workload at the state level, I think if the departments were staggered through the year, if not everything would be done right after the legislative session, that's, I think, where the delays are coming from. There's this complete crunch, and ARPA made it even worse. So many contracts have to be written when the legislator approves the budget, and everyone's there at the same time. If that was staggered by state department, but that's not how the legislator works. Because then you could have the same staff, the staffing would just be over a year rather than 100% of their work all has to be done in 1 quarter, or most of their work has to be done in 1 quarter.
Mm-hmm. So you're looking at more just the bridge funding, that like first quarter payment.
Yeah, to allow, and maybe some departments do 2 quarters, so their staffing at the state level, is not going up 500%, when the legislator approves everything.
Go ahead, Marianne.
So just this last year on June 28, which was a Friday, we found out that we would have funding starting July 1st. That's how late it was from OHCS funding to make us whole. And we didn't find out till actually, if we had to let employees go, we wouldn't have had enough time to do it before July 1st. They waited that long.
So are you recommending the program year or the bridge fund? Or like, what is it?
I like the bridge. I like the bridge.
Okay. And so in that particular case, if the state had said on July 28, we are canceling this program, we're not actually going to fund it, the bridge funding wouldn't have helped you with, you know, needing to do those layoffs in a, I mean, honestly, in a respectful way. But it would help you just move into the next program year, assuming you were approved. I think part of my thinking also with the program year is that it also allows for a little bit more of a dignified closeout, because you would have then a 6-month warning that your funding is not going to continue. And you can lay off staff, close programs, notify community of the closure of program.
So maybe I'm not understanding, because I thought the bridge was the 3-year contract with the bridge that the person that we were talking to, just one second, the lawyer that first talked from NOA. I didn't write down her name. I'm sorry.
Amanda.
So I thought the bridge was that. So what am I misunderstanding here? The 6-month window would be that they would have to let us know 6 months before that they were not going to fund us.
Right. So if we do a program year, then what that says in July 1, once agencies have gotten what they're going to get from the legislature, they start notifying programs like, we're going to continue your work. So by January 1, we'll have a new contract for you, or we're discontinuing your work and you need to start closing out or find other funding between now and December. The 3 years, I think, is a good one. And we have another example of that in another slide. And I think the bridge, what Dolly was saying is that they do the 3 years so that they are a little bit offset from the fiscal year. They're basically, or they're offset from the biennium. They're a year off the biennium. And then they do bridge funding between the end of the 3rd year contract as they're trying to get into the new contract, so that there's consistent payment even if things need to change in the contract.
So both of those sound like they would work.
Right. And I think the only difference is that the bridge one is doesn't necessarily account for closure of programs. Like you would still just kind of get notified at the end of the next fiscal year that your 3-year contract is now up and you won't get a renewal.
So if I am voting for the one that gives me the most notice for a humane way to work with my employees, then I choose the program year?
I think so. Yes.
Okay. That's clear. Thank you.
Any other thoughts on the program year? Gonna move. This will be this last one. Nope. Not quite the last one, but we'll keep going. Standard contract language. So this is kind of another one of those recommendations for more bodies of work. I think as we heard that there's a lot of the templates and materials that are maybe geared towards a different kind of business arrangement and not necessarily aligned with nonprofit business practices. So one of the recommendations was to have another stakeholder group that specifically goes through those and makes updates to the language. This could be, I noted in here, this could be the first body of work for the new group that we identified, like, because we said we wanted to maintain some group of advisors who continue to work on this, and getting further into the templates and the handbooks and the training could be their first body of work. And then we have some information in here about like what types of things should be included in contract language. And one of those was around the clearly delineating which terms are negotiable, including the insurance requirements in the fund award, identifying when there should be advance payments, when there will be reimbursable contracts only, and then basically some if a reimbursement contract is going to be utilized, some flexibility is built in for the organization to be able to fundraise elsewhere and offer services elsewhere. So thank you all so much for today. This was a ton of discussion and a ton of work. I really appreciate it. We're like so close to the finish line. It's nuts. But I will see you all either at the agenda planning meeting or at the August meeting, where we will have more of this updated information. And to the question about getting the updated slides, yes, I think we can post these now as they are, and then we'll have a fresh set for the August meeting where we've got our language cleared up and updated.
Thank you, Mercedes. Thank you. Thank you.
Everyone have a good day.